on nondetail.com.
Why?
Retired four-star General David Petraeus commanded Allied military forces in Afghanistan midway through the war. Today I spoke to him about where the Taliban takeover leaves us.
Certainly the outcome, I think, is catastrophic. It's also heartbreaking, it's tragic, and I do think there were alternative approaches, options that we, in fact, should have considered. But we are where we are now. And I think what's most important at this moment in time is to realize that there are many that we have so far left behind. And we must do everything we can with all the resources available to us to ensure that we meet the moral obligation to them.
Was there any version of the story that did not end with the Taliban back in charge?
Certainly there was. There was a sustained commitment that could have been pursued. I think that it was really the psychological effect of our announcement of the withdrawal, then the actual withdrawal, and then very significantly the withdrawal of the contractors that kept the U.S. provided helicopters and planes in the air and showed the Afghan soldiers on the ground that there would be someone coming to the rescue. And if soldiers on the ground don't think that that is coming, then they're going to do what we have seen Afghan soldiers do in the past week. And by the way, Afghan soldiers fought and died in huge numbers over the course of the past 2 decades. So the idea that they wouldn't fight for their country is something that I think is just not accurate.
Why did the international aid and reconstruction agenda for Afghanistan fail? The international community, led by the United States, has appropriated more than $100 billion in aid in the last decade to reconstruct Afghanistan and rebuild its unbalanced economy. Foreign donors pledged a projected $12 billion in civilian aid to Afghanistan over the next 4 years at a conference, but many made it conditional on protecting human rights and making progress on peace talks in a major shakeup for the country's economy. Some improvements were seen in terms of the GDP growth, life expectancy, poverty reduction, child and maternal health, education, and infrastructure. These improvements are relatively modest in relation to the amount of dollars poured into the country as aid. Moreover, this rate of improvement is too slow for Afghanistan to catch up with the rest of the developing world. Afghanistan still ranks third in the world in corruption according to Transparency International, which contributes to its extreme poverty. Although education is more widely available, the quality does not meet world standards. The teaching profession is not attractive because of the low pay. Despite improvements in the health sector, health indicators still remain below the average for low-income countries. Agriculture, the second largest contributor to GDP growth after services, declined by a projected 2% in 2015. Perhaps, for Afghanistan, as a post-conflict country, the aid was too little too soon. With the government institutions fragile and incapable of handling foreign aid, and with the weak technical capacity, the country was not ready to absorb and spend aid money wisely. Among the many side effects of aid is the Dutch disease effect. Flooding US dollars in billions into Afghanistan, a small open economy, adversely affected the country's economy in terms of inflation and exports. Foreign currency inflows appreciate Afghan currency, making domestic goods less price competitive on the export market, and preventing exporters from competing. It also killed the domestic demand for Afghan goods, as the goods became more expensive. This caused businesses to close and people to lose their jobs, resulting in increasing poverty. With more poverty, Afghanistan needed more aid money, ending up in a vicious cycle. Much of the corruption in Afghanistan also stemmed from an inflow of aid money, giving the country one of the worst reputations in the world. British Prime Minister David Cameron recently called the country fantastically corrupt. Aid is flowing in without question and mostly goes into the pockets of corrupt officials in a system that lacks accountability. As Peter Bauer, the famed development economist, has rightly said, foreign aid is an excellent method for transferring money from poor people in rich countries to rich people in poor countries. Talking about rich people in poor countries, the Afghan Minister of National Defense, Bismillah Mohammadi, issued a brief tweet Sunday after President Ashraf Ghani and senior officials had left Afghanistan. In a clear reference to the former president, he said, "They tied our hands behind our backs and sold the homeland, damn the rich man and his gang." Coming back to the reasons, most farmers left their farms and moved to cities to work for construction companies as gatekeepers or cooks, and thus contributed to the country's dependency on neighbors for food staples. Afghanistan ranks 177th in terms of regulation quality and efficiency for investment. With no improvements, the number of new firm registrations in 2015 remained well below that of 2012-13. This shows the difficulties in launching new businesses in Afghanistan. The fact that the country has made no improvements over the past many years shows that the government was not interested in creating jobs, or creating systems for entrepreneurships. The government officials did not rely on taxes to stay in office, they relied on the aid. They became so dependent on foreign aid, that the politicians in Afghanistan spent much of their time courting and catering to international donors, rather than to their constituents. Donors, not citizens, determined the future direction of the country, as the conditionality of aid gave donors the control over the use and direction of their funds. Afghanistan's aid dependency was having negative consequences not only economically, but politically too. At an international donor conference in November 2020, representatives from 70 countries, including Germany, US $510 million, Norway, US $72 million, the United Kingdom, US $227 million, and a number of humanitarian organizations pledged conditional aid of US $12 billion over the next 4 years, emphasizing the importance that Western nations have placed on the protection of human rights. Notably, the country's US $11 billion public expenditure each year was much higher than its modest revenues, which even after significant improvements recently, barely reached US $2.5 billion. The difference of about 75% of the expenses was funded by the international grants. When aid was cut off in the past, it was detrimental to the lives of Afghans. Afghanistan was also substantially reliant on military aid for its security forces that are embroiled in an intensifying war with the Taliban. Compared to the low-income country average of around 3% of GDP, security expenditure in Afghanistan stood at around 28% of the GDP in 2019, and most of this expenditure came from foreign assistance, especially from the US. The U.S. Congress appropriated at least US $86.4 billion for Afghan security assistance between fiscal years 2002 and 2019. Additionally, around 57% of total U.S. assistance has gone to the Afghan Security Forces Fund, and the U.S. military spends about US $36 billion annually, roughly US $100 million a day, in Afghanistan. The Afghan forces also lost out on the single most important military advantage of air power when private contractors and the US troops left. The security forces majorly rely on US-funded contractors to repair and maintain the dozens of fighter planes, cargo aircrafts, helicopters, etc. Over 18,000 contractors were due to depart soon, along with a majority of the US military contingent. Thus, reduction in aid was extremely detrimental to the already fragile security situation in Afghanistan, because without any on-ground US troops, an aid-dependent Afghan force with reduced capabilities was the only line of defense against the Taliban's incessantly violent tactics. What could the West have done better in terms of aid and reconstruction? Michael E. O'Hanlon wrote in a 2001 report, which meant the US was well aware of what it should do to reconstruct Afghanistan. But the question remains, has it done it? Michael wrote, "A good starting point for answering this question is to consider major development and reconstruction efforts. The Marshall Plan for Western Europe helped war-ravaged countries repair themselves quickly after World War II. It typically provided $100 to $200 per inhabitant per year over a period of several years, making for a cumulative total that often approached $1,000 per person in the end. But that effort was designed to help advanced countries rebuild infrastructure that had only recently been in good working condition. For Afghanistan, therefore, a more analogous model may be the experiences of South Korea and Taiwan in the 1950s and early 1960s. The first had been hurt by war much worse than the second, but in both cases, the United States wanted to help key security partners build up their economies as well as their military defenses on short order. Aid efforts could not be quite as rapid as in Western Europe or Japan, but in the end they were comparably generous. The United States provided roughly $50 to $75 per person per year for more than a decade, again making for an aggregate total ranging from $500 to $1,000. Based on these models, it might be reasonable to imagine that 20 to 25% of aid would be used for food and housing and medical care, 25% for rebuilding and developing infrastructure, 15 to 20% for education, 5 to 10% for government, 10 to 15% for agriculture, and the related task of clearing landmines, and 10 to 15% for building up security forces while helping excess militia fighters demobilize and find civilian jobs. In the case of Afghanistan, however, the latter figure for security aid might have to be larger than in many previous cases. Was this followed? Without which all the aid provided was more superficial and most of it went into the hands of a few corrupt rich people. As Carol Graham and Michael argued in a 1997 Brookings book, A Half-Penny on the Federal Dollar, The Future of Development Aid, and as other analysts such as the World Bank's David Dollar have demonstrated as well, aid can very easily be wasted if recipient governments do not create conducive economic and legal environments. One of the most important findings of modern political science is that countries moving towards democracy are highly vulnerable to conflict during their periods of intense transition. For evidence, one need only recall experiences such as Angola's in the early 1990s, when Jonas Savimbi agreed to elections but then returned to war after losing at the ballots to President Dos Santos, Rwanda in the mid-1990s when a fledgling peace process broke down and ended in genocide, and Somalia in the early 1990s when US and UN efforts to create a new Somali government failed, after which time militia leader Aidid's forces killed dozens of Pakistanis and Americans in ensuing battles. Second, and relatedly, donors should provide much of their aid and technical advice directly at the regional and grassroots level, an argument also advanced by the International Crisis Group in a 2001 study on Afghanistan's reconstruction needs. Doing so should dampen the struggle for power and resources in Kabul, as leaders from various regions and ethnic groups find comfort in knowing their peoples will be aided regardless of who wields the most influence at the federal level. Providing a good deal of aid in this way would also give donors leverage with regional leaders and governments inside of Afghanistan. All would receive some aid for feeding and housing their people, clearing landmines, and rebuilding roads. But only those that avoided major corruption and massive human rights abuses, while also following sound economic practices, would receive generous aid packages for broader development and reconstruction purposes. Again, was this done? Visuals this week tells us that this was not followed. Situation wouldn't have been this worse if the Afghan government focused upon involving Kabul in trade, foreign direct investment, FDI, microfinance, savings, and taxes, the instruments that the developed world uses to finance economic development and job creation. The Afghan government should have worked closely with the rest of the world, especially its neighbors, to open their doors for Afghan goods. The government could have also simplified legal procedures and other policies to facilitate entry for new businesses and support both domestic and foreign investment. FDI would bring in new technologies and new managerial skills, and help in creating jobs and capacity building. Innovations in microfinance to encourage small-scale entrepreneurs by providing support and opportunities could have helped in their economic growth. What did the US and Taliban negotiate? When the US declared a specific target date for the withdrawal of the forces, in all practical purposes, what were they negotiating for in Doha? Had the Taliban refused to agree to any terms, what could the US have done? It has already announced its departure. So, whether Taliban agreed or not, the US was leaving Afghanistan. Notably, Taliban didn't honor the promise to reduce violence following the February 2020 US-Taliban agreement in Doha. More than 3,000 civilians were killed and 5,800 others were injured in Afghanistan in 2020. A string of attacks have continued in 2021 too. A report by the UN monitoring team recently concluded that the Taliban and the al-qaeda remain closely aligned and show no indication of breaking ties, which is contradictory to the promises the group made under the Doha Agreement. The Taliban delegation also refused to show up for the Istanbul talks amid escalating violence, highlighting its disregard for a peaceful political settlement. Taliban demanded the cancellation of United Nations sanctions in exchange for the US asking for a 3 to 6 month extension for troop withdrawal, which could not take place before the pre-set deadline of 1 May 2021. Such was the situation of the US during these peace negotiations in Doha. What are the consequences of Taliban-led Afghanistan? Firstly, women and young girls may suffer, because the Taliban's ideology towards women remains regressive, orthodox, and downright extremist. This apprehension has been adequately validated recently, with the Taliban having targeted women in the media, female judges, and even schoolgirls. Secondly, the human rights of various ethnic groups such as the Shia Hazaras, Ismaili Shias, Hindus and Sikhs remain in question and need to be protected. These communities have been historically persecuted and dominated by the Sunni majorities, and according to the 2020 International Religious Freedom Report, terrorist groups in Afghanistan continue to target specific religious and ethno-religious minorities. Why did world countries invest in Afghanistan? Western leaders have promised to be generous in helping Afghanistan recover from 2 decades of war, recognizing that their failure to do so after the Afghan Mujahideen defeated the Soviet Union in 1989 helped give rise to the very conditions that the Taliban and al-qaeda later exploited. What's